Immigration has become a global flashpoint, and Africans are often at the center of it. The United Nations estimates that Africa accounts for about 9% of the world's international migrants. Yet, Africans face some of the toughest visa restrictions and higher deportation rates in Europe, according to Eurostat. Just this weekend, and as we did chronicle a couple of minutes ago, London witnessed one of the largest anti-immigration rallies in Britain's recent history, drawing over 100,000 people. A few months ago in South Africa, citizens took to the streets with similar demands, giving ultimatums for undocumented migrants to leave the country. So at the same time, remittances from Africans abroad reached an estimated $54 billion in 2023, underscoring their importance to economies back home. Yet, across Europe, the Middle East, and even within Africa, Africans are too often portrayed as burdens or threats. So today on The Conversation, I'm joined by Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast, a political analyst at the Nelson Mandela University, Akabaha, South Africa. Professor Breakfast, thank you so much for joining us. And while we welcome Professor Breakfast, we also have Professor Roger Southall, Professor of Sociology at the University of Witwatersrand, of course, still in Johannesburg, South Africa. Professor Southall, thank you so much for coming around.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
All right, you're welcome. So even as we await audio quality from Professor Breakfast, I start with Professor Southall. Across several countries, there are claims that migrants are displacing citizen workers, overburdening public services and fueling insecurity, and also eroding traditional values. How true are these claims? Professor Southall.
Oh, me, sorry. Yes. Well, I think first of all, we need to state that these actions in terms of preventing people accessing public services, whether or not they are citizens, is unconstitutional. And I think that's very important to register. And I think the other thing, we need to put this in context, of course. We know that in South Africa, the economy is stalling. Growth has been stagnant for some years. Many people are feeling excluded. And unfortunately, this is giving the opportunity for certain activist groups to blame foreigners for the miseries of ordinary people. It's a fairly classic tactic, which is obviously much wider than being African. It goes well back into history, but it is very unfortunate, and it means that many Africans who are working in South Africa are being subject to discriminatory behavior, and as I mentioned in the first, which is unconstitutional. When we enter the story of whether it's against African values, I would say yes, it is, but I'm not necessarily the best person to speak to that. African values is a very wide concept, but I do think that that is contrary to my understanding of what people talk to as Ubuntu.
Okay, so let me talk to Professor Breakfast. From your general view, how you see it, are Africans truly burdens and threats, or blessings and supports to continents they migrate to? Professor Breakfast. Okay, so let me just throw that question back to Professor Southall and also get his opinion. In as much as you say it's a lot of discrimination I would see against African migrants, but then when you look at it from a general point of view, would you say that Africans are burdens and threats, or they are blessings, looking at the continents or the countries that they migrate to?
Well, I think it is, unfortunately, it comes with many of the strains of the post-independent, post-colonial economies. Africa, of course, is subject very much to international trading headwinds, and very often commodity prices go down as much as they go up, and this provides a lot of problems for many countries who are heavily dependent on the export of commodities. And so when we find there are strains and stresses, low economic growth, we find that, again, outgroups and foreigners are blamed. So, for instance, in Ghana and Nigeria at various times, where foreign labor has often been used in industries such as the cocoa trade, when times are bad, there have been protests against so-called aliens and foreigners who in fact have contributed labor to these important industries. And this has led to border tensions across West Africa. So this is not simply a South African problem. It is an Africa-wide problem, I think, related to the nature of post-colonial economies.
Okay, so let's see if we can finally connect with Professor Breakfast. Professor Breakfast? Okay, so I'm told that we've lost communication with the other professor, but then we'll just continue with Professor Southall. So I understand there are issues around the economy and how it's affecting the ease of doing business on African, on the African continent. But then looking at the issues that actually speak to the hostility meted out to African migrants, there's the allegation of illegal migration, expired documents, heightened crime, insecurity, and the likes. So are these African migrants also to blame for their misfortune, or you would blame the government?
Well, governments are always the target for discontent about economies, and very often governments themselves are very happy to displace blame being placed upon them by diverting it onto various outgroups. So unfortunately, again, foreigners often get blamed for sins for which they are not responsible. And of course, at times, so-called aliens are responsible for criminal actions and for violence. But the question is whether they are more responsible than local people, which usually it is found to be the case that they are not. Simply blame is usually placed upon them because they are an easy target. The problem is we need to ask is, what are governments going to do about it? Do governments respond responsibly to such accusations? And I was listening to your correspondent from London talking about Keir Starmer's response to the racist demonstrations over the weekend in Britain. And she was complaining that, in fact, his response has been inadequate and has been ambiguous. Because on the one hand, it is very difficult, it is very correct of him to condemn racism and in London on one hand, but on the other hand, he has banned Palestine Action, which has been full of protests against peaceful demonstrations against the genocide taking place in Israel, with far more arrests made than of the racists over the weekend. So government reactions are often very ambiguous.
Okay, I understand that part. And I also understand the part where you said that migrants are soft targets. Though we're still going to dwell more on what governments should have done or should do in this situation, we still see global narratives that ignore the economic contributions of Africans in host countries. Is this a narrative that can change? Because we know that whatever the situation is, Africans will still continue to migrate to places they consider as areas that can provide better living, better infrastructure, and better opportunities for growth.
I think the point needs to be continuously made by governments and by members of civil society that migration is a constant. You're not going to get rid of it because Africa is a continent of movement of peoples between over borders. That is not going to disappear. And so the whole issue needs to be brought out onto the open, and the merits and demerits of migration need to be taken into account. Now, of course, if you have mass migration, which impacts upon the scarcity of resources in a given country, then that's an issue to be taken. But usually, the impact which migrants have on resources is exaggerated by those who are wanting to exploit the situation. And I think this is very much the situation in in South Africa, where allegations are being made that aliens are taking up undue share of hospital beds and so forth, and coming to South Africa to access the advantages which South Africa has to offer. This is a matter of responsible immigration control, which is actually not happening. But I'm afraid, but what we do need is for politicians not to take the easy route out and to say to people, look, we have to deal with this calmly and collectively and recognize that migration is a constant and it's not going to go away.
So when you look at what's happening in London, in America with mass deportation and, of course, Trump laws on migration and all, and we see what's happening in South Africa also, the underlying factor has to do with people not having documents that certifies or gives them the opportunity to live legally and work in host nations. So is it actually right or maybe unfair to say that Africans are largely undocumented or illegal migrants around the world?
Well, of course. I mean, if you're looking at, for instance, I was reading this morning, or was it yesterday, about the latest migration figures in Britain. And the narrative you get from much of the media is that the level of migration is increasing. Well, in fact, over the last 2 years, the level of in-migration to Britain has actually fallen, certainly off a high figure in 2023. But nonetheless, the level of migration is falling. Much of the migration, incoming migration into Britain, is actually students who are coming to take degrees in British universities, which need their fees, and they are coming for a short-term period, and they are not entitled to stay in Britain unless they get the relevant visas. And so when we're looking at migration statistics, we need to break it down. And in Britain, it is not just about people coming over in boats. It is much broader than that. And I think the other thing that leaders everywhere need to stress about migration is that it overlaps with people seeking asylum for political reasons, from political persecution. And we really need to stress the humanitarian aspects. And if people are economic migrants, which is often used as a term of abuse and as if it's totally illegitimate, we need to recognize that people are economic migrants, usually not by choice, but simply because they are desperate. They need to make a living, and they are trying to provide a living for their families at home. So we need a rational discussion, but unfortunately, I'm afraid this is not what the right wing wants. The right wing wants to exploit it and to use it for its own advantage.
Well, I tell you, whether they like it or not, these conversations are the type that need to be, of course, brought to the front burner, most especially as it affects Africans who are, in other countries trying to make a better living for them and, of course, for their families. Professor Southall, we will quickly go on a break, and when we return, we'll look at probable solutions to this. Do stay with us. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be back in a bit. Well, it seems as though it's quite safe to say that the black-skinned race is actually an endangered species when it comes to living in places other than a place called home, with the protests that we've seen going on in several countries and, of course, the hostilities against this set of people. And now we are asking the question, why is it that a lot of people are asking for the revision of the anti-immigration laws in these countries and demanding that African migrants should go back home? But I've been having this discussion with Professor Roger Southall, who's been sharing his thoughts with us for over a couple of minutes now. And even as we coast home on this, Professor Southall, what do you think can be done now to balance the narrative on the part of the African governments in terms of their economy, making the environment suitable for the citizens to live and thrive. On the part of these citizens also who are looking for better pastures, and on behalf of the host communities who seem inimical to the influx of these African migrants.
Well, I think you're asking what governments can do at a continental level.
Yes.
Well, I think as Africa moves towards more free trade across borders in Africa, then that is only going to increase the level of migration I would anticipate. And so again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Governments need to step in and make it very clear that migration is a constant, it's not going to go away, and that it is actually that migration, generally speaking, is a boost to economic opportunities and a provider of jobs rather than something that takes jobs away from people. Many migrants obviously move into territory where they have the skills to contribute to local economies. That means they often provide jobs, not simply to their family members and fellow countrymen, but also to the local populations. And so I think that what politicians need to do and economists need to make the point very strongly that on the whole, migration is a boost to economic growth rather than a detriment, and that overall that it is a plus for citizens of any one country. To be fair, there are going to be niches of the economy which may be taken over by foreigners, which some people may suffer, but the overall, we've got to stress the overall benefits of migration.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Roger Southall, a professor of sociology at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, for sharing your thoughts with us.